Okay, so for this video, let's have a look at the anatomy of the brain. And you'll all be happy to hear that our brain does fill more capacity than we see here on the x-ray of Homer Simpson. Okay, a big part of what the rest of this unit is going to be for you guys is learning the anatomy of the nervous system, in particular the brain, and learning the functions of each one of these parts. So the brain is very complicated. The central nervous system is a very complicated system. So it's important that we break it down functionally as well as anatomically, and then understand what each part of that brain is responsible for. Okay, so like I said, a big part of this for you guys is going to be just learning the anatomy, and so learning where things are, and then learning what the function is. So let's start off with the brain first, and we'll talk about the cerebrum. So we looked at the cerebrum yesterday in the lab. Everyone should have got a good idea of that. And here's our cerebrum, and that's going to be the gray matter of our brain. It's the largest portion, and it divides into a left and right hemisphere by the longitudinal fissure. We looked at that last day in the lab. We see it with the sheep brains. The next part of the brain that we'll look at is going to be the diencephalon. Now the diencephalon is going to be the area below the corpus callosum that will it'll be between the two hemispheres of the cerebrum. So when we're talking about that, we're talking about this area right here, and that's going to be the diencephalon. Okay, so the area between the cerebral hemispheres, it's going to contain the thalamus and the hypothalamus, and it's going to be below the corpus callosum. The next part of the brain, the next region of the brain, is going to be the brain stem. The brain stem is going to be consistent of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So that little part there is going to be the brain stem, and what the brain stem does is it helps connect the diencephalon and the cerebrum, as well as the cerebellum, to the spinal cord. So this is kind of a place where everything comes together. And then the final part of the brain that we need to look at is right here on the back part of the cerebrum, on the inferior side, and that's going to be the cerebellum. So those are the main divisions of physical divisions of the brain. Now, what are each one of these divisions responsible for? Well, we did touch on this in the lab. The cerebrum, of course, is going to be the biggest layer. It's going to be the outer layer of the brain, and it's going to be responsible for your conscious thought. Okay, that's the way you reason, thinking critically, your memories, your thoughts, abstract mental function. All of that takes place in the cerebrum. Below that, we'll have the diencephalon. Now, that's going to make up the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The thalamus is basically a relay center, right? So the thalamus will take the sensory input from the peripheral nervous system and relay it to parts of the cerebrum so that it can be processed. So think of the thalamus as a sorting or a relay center. Right below the thalamus, and the reason we know that is because hypo means below, so hypothalamus, under the thalamus, that structure is going to be responsible for maintaining homeostasis. It controls the autonomic nervous system, and it also controls the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus has a far-reaching responsibility in terms of the endocrine system, the system that controls hormonal function in our body. And we're going to talk about that in the next unit. The next part is the brainstem, and that consists of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Now, the main function for the midbrain physically is to connect the cerebrum and the diencephalon with the spinal cord. So SC here, it means spinal cord. Individually, the midbrain is going to control the reflex centers that we associated with vision and hearing. So when we react to something just by sound or sight, that gets processed right in the midbrain. It doesn't travel any further into the cerebrum for any thought. It gets processed right there. The pons is going to be something that will help in the regulation of our breathing, and it's also the site that connects to the cerebellum to the brainstem. And then finally we get the very base part of the brainstem just before it turns into the spinal cord, and that's going to be the medulla oblongata. And this is going to link the brain to the spinal cord, and it also controls a lot of stuff that would happen autonomically, so stuff we wouldn't think about. And just for an example, the heartbeat would be one of those things. The last thing that we have left is of those main divisions is the cerebellum. Now the cerebellum is a site that will control voluntary muscle movement. It also helps maintain our balance and our muscle tone. So if you're standing up, just listening to somebody talk, or just paying attention to something else, your cerebellum is the part of the brain that's controlling all of the muscles in your trunk that holds you upright. It's controlling the small movements in your legs that keep your balance and keep you from falling over. And that's the role of the cerebellum. One thing you guys can do for this section is refer to the table. Whoops, I can't quite see this here now. If you refer to the table that I gave out in lab yesterday, but this is also part of the notes. This has the different parts, the divisions of the brain, and it also goes into the functions for each one. So you can definitely refer to this as you're going through the notes for this section of the class notes. Okay, another structure that we should talk about when we're talking about the central nervous system is the meninges. Now, we did mention this in a previous unit, and we talked about the connective tissue membranes. Well, these are the ones that surround both the brain and the spinal cord. So meninges are connective tissue membranes, and they'll help protect the central nervous system. Now, there's 3 different meninges that cover and protect the brain. There's the dura mater, the pia mater, and the arachnoid mater. One way I use to remember that is I think of, in order of closest to the brain to furthest, I think of the word pad, and a pad, of course, is a way of cushioning, and one of the major functions of the meninges is to cushion the brain. So the meninges pad the brain. So if we start right at in the inside with the pia mater, if you touched the brain yesterday in lab, there's a good chance that you actually touched the pia mater. It's the most inside layer of the meninges. It's quite thin, it's quite soft, and it covers directly the tissue of the brain. So that's the inside layer. The middle layer is called the arachnoid layer. Sometimes it's called the arachnoid space, because if you look at it microscopically, it actually looks like a spider's web. And arachnoid is a scientific term for spider. So the arachnoid layer, it gives lots of room for circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. So it allows the brain to kind of float in this protective layer of cerebrospinal fluid. And then the outside layer is the densest one, it's the thickest one, and this is called the dura mater, and this is a very thick connective tissue heavy membrane that serves for a heavy layer of protection on the outside part of the brain. So if we were going to, if for example you were a surgeon and you were going to drill down to reach the brain, first you'd have to go through the skin, then you'd need to go through the skull or the cranium, then you would hit the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, the arachnoid layer, and the pia mater before you finally hit the cranium, or sorry, the cerebellum, sorry, the cerebrum. All right, so our brain floats around in a clear liquid that we call cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so it doesn't float around in direct contact with blood. The nutrients are delivered to the brain by this cerebrospinal fluid. So the main function of the cerebrospinal fluid is to support the nervous tissue. It also cushions any shocks. So we need to think of the central nervous system as a really delicate system, a really delicate organ. So any trauma being bashed around or anything like that would have a pretty bad effect on the central nervous system. So this would act as a cushion. So any shock would be absorbed by the liquid before it gets transferred to the brain. Another thing the cerebrospinal fluid will do is it'll carry nutrients from the blood supply to the brain cells. So to the neurons that make up the brain and the different parts of the brain. Now the cerebrospinal fluid is going to be produced in these spaces that we find inside the brain that we call ventricles. Now the ventricles in the heart are they're kind of the same, but they're kind of different. In the heart, they are muscular and they contract to push the blood around. In the brain, they serve as empty spaces so that we can have circulation of cerebrospinal fluid, so that we can provide cells with fresh nutrients and oxygen and energy, and then we can also take away any waste that needs to be removed from the metabolic requirements of the cells in the brain and the spinal cord. So the cerebrospinal fluid is secreted, or it's produced through these membranes in the ventricles, and it gets filtered through these processes called the choroid plexus. A choroid plexus is just going to help take anything out that could be harmful to the central nervous system before it has any chance of contacting the brain or the spinal cord. Alright, so we've introduced the different parts of the brain, we've talked about the circulation. Now let's talk about the different bits and pieces of the brain one by one. And we'll start with the biggest one, which is the cerebrum. So the cerebrum, of course, is going to be divided into two cerebral hemispheres, the left and the right. And then from that division, if we look at it even closely, we can divide it furthermore into four pretty easily visible lobes, and I'll show you that in the next slide. Now each one of these lobes are going to be covered by the cerebral cortex, which is the outside part of the brain. Okay, and that's going to have these different centers that we'll talk about shortly. Now each portion of the cortex is associated with a different type of function. So different places in the brain are responsible for different functions. And we also talked about yesterday the structures known as the gyri and the sulci, and we talked about their role in increasing the amount of gray matter we can have within the cerebral cortex. So let's have a look at those different lobes. And on this slide here, we're just having a look at the cerebrum, and we can see these four relatively discernible lobes. So the lobe in orange is going to be the frontal lobe. Just behind that we have the parietal lobe, which is of course right underneath the parietal bones. We also have the temporal lobe, which is going to be in blue, and that's going to be behind the temporal bones. And then the last one, the green one, is the occipital lobe, which of course is near the occipital bone. So these bones, these lobes are named in close relation to the bones that make up the cranium. So if we look at the function of each one of these lobes, we'll get an idea of where everything is kind of placed in the brain. So in the frontal lobe of the cerebrum, we're going to find the primary motor area. So this is what controls our conscious control of skeletal muscle. So when we want to move, this is where those nerve impulses are processed. We'll also see, in this part, we'll see areas that are important for speech. If we look at the parietal lobes, these are going to be where the majority of our sensories areas are interpreted. Okay, so touch, we're also going to see stuff there about spatial thought. So it gives us an idea of the estimation of distance, and some people are definitely better at doing that than others. The temporal lobes, this is where we're going to process auditory data, so the stuff that impulses we receive from the ear, sound, vibration. It also contains the olfactory area, which is where the receptors from the nose will be processed. So the temporal lobe will process not only sound, but it'll also process smell as well. And then the occipital, this is right towards the back of the brain, and this is going to have our visual cortex. So it's going to receive all of the signals that are perceived by our eyes. And vision is a huge part of our senses. In different animals it varies, but if you were to look at animals that have a very high visual acuity, like I mentioned birds yesterday, they'll have a very well developed occipital lobe. So Here's a look at the lobes again, and on each lobe we've got different colors, and we've also highlighted where each part of these lobes are, what function they're responsible